Okay, thank you for the reminder. Yay. So, okay, so any questions there? The other thing I'm going to try to do is pull up the chat. There's participants. Let me see if I can pull up the chat also. More chat. There we go. There we go. I have like 100 screens open on one tiny little laptop screen, so. Okay, so yeah, it's being recorded. Thank you very much for reminding me. Okay, proposal development. So we're going to just talk kind of high level about proposal development. We're going to spend a lot more time later today talking about budget development as part of that proposal development. But some things you need to know for the CRA in terms of proposal development. Okay, preliminary proposals. And everybody can still see my screen, right? Okay, I see some nods, yay. Okay, so a preliminary proposal. It may be required by a sponsor, it may not. Preliminary proposals can go by a lot of different names. They can be called preliminary proposals. They can be called a letter of intent. It could be a white paper, a concept paper. Are there other names that you all have heard preliminaries go by? I'm trying to think of any others. Those are kind of the typical ones. But oftentimes they're used by the agencies for different purposes. Okay. Generally, again, we're talking in general because everyone is going to be different and you need to go read the solicitation guidelines to find out what they want in that preliminary proposals. Typically, it's a title. At the very least, they want a title and they want to know the investigators and where the investigators are from. Are they from multiple institutions or not? So they want to know that topical matter. Okay. A preliminary proposal may require a budget. It may not. Again, it may be mandatory. It may not. It may be used to invite back a solicited proposal. It may not. So it really just depends upon the intention. So for a true preliminary proposal, the agency that was using these the most was National Science Foundation. At least a couple of their directorates, Engineering and Biology Directorate, were the two that were using preliminary proposals. These were abbreviated proposals, abbreviated in page limitation and what you had to provide the sponsor. Typically, you did not have to include a budget, and they would have, the National Science Foundation would review the preliminaries and decide which ones they wanted to invite back, which full proposals. So an investigator couldn't submit a full proposal unless they had submitted the preliminary and had been invited back. Okay. A couple of things there, those preliminaries still had to go through sponsored research offices, so they still had to have an authorized organizational rep sign them. But again, usually the budget was like $0 or $1, depending upon the solicitation. So no budget required, but still had to be submitted by the sponsor program's office. Okay. More often than not, what we see are letters of intent. A letter of intent can be voluntary, or it could be mandatory. And typically the purpose of the letter of intent is so that the sponsoring agency knows what to expect in terms of the types of proposals that are coming in, particularly for a unsolicited announcement. What are the areas of science? How many proposals are they going to receive? That way they can get the review panels together. So even if the letter of intent is voluntary, it may be something that you want to encourage your investigator, if you're somebody who works directly with investigator, to do. Just because it's really useful for the agency to understand what types of proposals they're going to get in and start getting their review panels together. Okay. It's also important if the letter of intent was mandatory, it was required, and the investigator didn't do it, they might not be able to submit a full proposal. So that's different than inviting the person back for a full proposal. Typically, a letter of intent is very limited to just like the name and the title and the investigators. So just know that there are all different types of preliminary proposals and agencies use them differently. But in general, the LOI is used to assemble the review panel. As far as full proposals go, again, there are different types of full proposals. There can be a brand new proposal, the first time the research has actually been proposed. It could be a resubmission. Maybe it's an amended application that was previously submitted but not funded. The important thing to understand here is that some agencies have very specific requirements for amended applications, such as the investigator might have to take a page to address all the changes in this application from the last time they submitted and weren't funded. So based on reviewer feedback, what changes have they made? How is this different? Okay, is it truly a new application or is it just an amended or a resubmission? So it used to be the case that some agencies would actually limit the number of times you could resubmit the same proposal. That's something you would want to check with agency by agency. It could be a revision of a proposal that's been peer reviewed. It could just be a progress report to get the next year of funding. So it's important that we understand the proposal type, because the proposal type is going to dictate what's included in that proposal. So for example, if it's a renewal proposal is basically when somebody's they wrote a proposal, they were awarded for typically it's multi years of funding. That last year is over, but the research is continuing. So they want to submit a proposal based on what they learned in that first proposal. In that case, a renewal, the investigator actually has to show how they made progress with that first set of funding. And typically that's in the form of publications. So whenever I worked with investigators, my first question is this a new proposal? Is this a resubmission of something that you submitted but it wasn't approved? Is this a revision? Is this a renewal? What type of proposal is it? Because typically there's some place on a cover page to indicate the type of proposal, and then that indicates what's required in the proposal. Because sometimes for, say, a resubmission, you might have different requirements than for a new, or renewal might have different requirements than a new or resubmission. You got to know where you're starting from. Right? So there are all different types of full proposals. And then supplement is also up here. A lot of times agencies will offer an administrative supplement. A supplement may be to add an undergrad to existing research. It could be a supplement to add a teacher out there in a school district to a line of research. And one that I saw a lot when I was at a predominantly undergraduate institution was a supplement to add an investigator at a PUI, predominantly undergraduate institution, to a proposal that's at a R1 institution, a Research 1 institution. So you know if it's a supplement, and a lot of times the supplements don't go through the same type of peer review process that some of the other proposal types go through. But it's always good to know which one you're submitting, because what's required and how you submit it could vary depending upon the proposal type. So generally, these proposals have an administrative component, so all that information that's in your cover page about your organization, your institution, like your tax ID number, your DUNS number, which is going to the unique entity identifier, your physical business location, where the work is being done, right, the performance location. So it has all that administrative stuff that back in the day we typed all that in. Now a lot of times our systems have that information embedded for us, so we don't have to type it all in. Though some systems we still have to type a lot of that information in. Then there's the scientific stuff. That's the stuff that your investigators are writing, right? That's the meat potatoes. That's the introduction and the background and the methodology, all of the sciencey stuff. Okay. And then we have our financial component, which is the budget and the budget justification. So the next slide actually shows a breakdown of these full proposal components. Again, a general breakdown because we couldn't put every single type out there. But one thing is that as soon as I say all, somebody will come up with an example of not all, but a majority, at least, of federal full proposals are going to require some type of institutional review and approval, because we're making a lot of promises as an institution when we submit that proposal, that we can agree to certain things and that we have certain systems in place in order to be good stewards of the federal funds. So hopefully there's some type of institutional approval, and you have folks authorized at your institution, just like we have at CSU, for signing and submitting on behalf of the institution. Contrary to the investigator's point of view and even some chairs and deans, they typically are not the authorized institutional official. Is typically somebody in your sponsored programs office or at a VP level, and sometimes your president as well, depending upon how you are structured. Okay, so full proposal components, this just is another way to look at what I just said. The administrative stuff, which is typically the stuff we help with, right? Filling out all of that background information, performance sites, all of our administrative contacts, who's our fiscal contact if they have questions, who's our pre-award contact if they have questions. Okay. Then we have the science stuff that the investigator is responsible for, such as the abstract, the aims, or the objectives, the research strategy, the scope of work, and any type of compliance plans for humans or animals or biosafety, or even conflict of interest now. Okay. Then we have the programmatic stuff, and depending upon where you sit and depending upon the roles and responsibilities at your institution, research administrators may or may not help with the programmatic stuff. You're probably not going to be writing your investigator's biographical sketch for them, but it may be something that you're collecting biosketches, particularly if there are a number of investigators on a submission. You might be looking to make sure you have all of them, that they conform to the sponsor's requirements, that they're all in the same font type, that type of information. Same thing with the other support pages. Other support, something that your investigators should be generating. Facilities and institutional resources, that might be something that your institution provides, some canned information, or again, it could be something your investigator is responsible for. Same thing with collecting letters of intent, letters of collaboration, or any type of like resource sharing plans, postdoc mentoring programs, data management programs. I think that all really varies depending upon institutional roles and responsibilities. But the finance pieces is where often we step in as research administrators. So we're kind of like the bookends there, with the administrative stuff on one hand and the financial stuff on one hand. We might have investigators who are savvy with their budgets and they come to us with a pretty complete budget. We have investigators who maybe aren't so savvy with budgeting, and we need to work with them to develop the budget. And a lot of what we're going to spend some time on today is the budget, but typically it's going to be a detailed budget, a budget justification, and any kind of supporting documentation if it's required, such as a quote for a piece of equipment. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but just kind of know where we come in as research administrators, or there on those ends. And that's really all we had. We didn't have much that we left off from the last time. You all have the acronyms, and as I mentioned at the end of our time together, I'm going to send out a complete list of acronyms for you. Sometimes it's just kind of good to practice, not only that you know the acronym, but the relevance. So that's why I provided those for you. This was just a little tidbit. Uniform guidance is actually short for uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements. It's 3 circulars in one, and we'll be going through that in a different session. Remember, 3 to 1 there. Okay, that was your homework, and based on your homework, I have new questions for you. So this is just going to be a chiming in the chat box, which I can see now. So let's go. These are some of the ones that you all have written. I might have tweaked them just slightly, but here we go. Here are a few that you all came up with. Which of the following is not a federal sponsor? National Science Foundation, Gates Foundation, U.S. Department of Energy, or NASA? B, Gates Foundation, right? Still a sponsor, still has a lot of the same requirements that we've talked about, still has solicitation, still has a review, just doesn't happen to be a federal sponsor, okay? Where can you find funding opportunities? Newspaper, grants.gov, subscription-based services, or both B and C? D, correct, right? And I talked about last time that we use the SPIN, the InfoEd SPIN database. actually learned after that that our library might have a subscription to Pivot, which used to be Community of Science. But those are two of the major subscription services that I talked about. There are others. If you are a GRC, Grants Resource Center school, you might have access to their grant search mechanism as well. So Sylvia, are you all a GRC member?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
That's what we use mainly for our search. We don't have any other subscription.
Okay. And back in the day, maybe GRC still does this. They used to, if an investigator wanted a sample proposal, you could write GRC and they would, at the time, they would FedEx it really quickly. I'm assuming now that they just scan it and email it to you.
Yep, that's what they do.
Yeah, back in the day, they would FedEx it, but it would be there within a couple days. So that's
that's funny.
Yeah. So, okay.
You're not that old, Tricia.
I am. When I started, we had libraries of funding opportunities. Those announcements that we share out, my first job was to get them out of the mail, photocopy them, and send them in intercampus mail to the departments to share.
Wow.
Yep. That's how we got work done. It was very, and on proposal submission day, my job was to make the 52 copies and collate them and bind them and run to the post office to have them postmarked by X date and time. So.
Did you ever chase down a FedEx plane?
I did not. I did not have to do that, but I did stand over a counter at USPS going, I need to see a postmark on that.
That's great.
Okay, so yes, B and C, y'all got that. Which of the following are types of sponsors? A, associations and societies, B, international organizations, C, private foundations, or D, all of the above? D, all of the above. Yep, you all got it. Which government agency supports research in ocean salinity? I thought this one was really interesting. Remember I said to kind of know in general what the federal agencies support and don't be surprised. And I gave breast cancer as an example under DOD. Does anybody know this one? So we have stuff all over the place. The one we know for sure that has an open solicitation on this one right now is actually NASA. And the person who submitted this said they were surprised that NASA dealt with land stuff. They think of NASA only dealing with, space and anything not on the Earth. So they were kind of surprised by this one. I didn't go to see if there was anything. NSF might have some stuff on ocean salinity as well, especially with their polar programs. So that could be as well. But NASA definitely has a current one. Would you have to know a current open solicitation on the exam? No, you should still know in general kind of the areas that the different federal agencies support. Okay, FAR stands for Fascinating Actual Regulations. B, Federal Acquisition Regulations, C, Federal Acquisition Recommendations, or D, the Federal Act Recommendations. So everybody's saying B, correct. And we're going to talk more about FAR in sessions to come. Oh, and some of you won't see your questions here because they actually dovetail nicely under some other areas, and so I'm going to use your questions under other areas. So this isn't everybody's question. There were some that I felt like were more appropriate to deal with later. And Sylvia, I meant to get yours in the one today and didn't, but that's going to be one for next time. It was really, really great. And I'm putting Sylvia on the spot here. Hers was, you really had to read it and think about it. And it was nice because that's representative of some of the questions. You might get questions like the ones you see here. Very short question. You might get one. There were times I'd be like, I just can't even process that right now. I have to come back to it because there was so much to read and understand. You'll see both types of questions on the exam. Okay. Which of the following announcement type is solicited? A BAA, a broad agency announcement, an FOA, a funding opportunity announcement, a PA, a program announcement, or an RFA, a request for application. So remember, this is solicited, not unsolicited. Okay, so the correct answer on this one is actually a BAA, a broad agency announcement. So a request for proposal, a request for bid, a request for quote, and a BAA. Those are typically very specific, solicited for contracts, cooperative agreements, and grants. These others, an FOA, PA, and RFA, are very general open solicitations, unsolicited. Okay, which platform can be used to submit proposals to the National Science Foundation? Grants.gov, WebGate, SAM.gov, or Google.com? Okay, and everybody's saying grants.gov, and that's correct. And also research.gov and or Fastlane, depending upon the program, are two others. Okay. Which federal agency is not in the top 5 for research expenditures? Anybody have a guess on this one? Department of Defense, DHHS, NSF, or USDA?
Say D.
So the answer on this one's actually, National Science Foundation is really small compared to some of the others. And it's interesting because while DHHS is that huge umbrella that has a number of agencies under it, even the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is under the DHHS umbrella. NIH's budget is still far exceeds the NSF budget. NIH's budget for fiscal year 16 was like 31 billion, where NSF was only 7 billion in the same year. So that's why if you are submitting a proposal that really reeks of health-related information to the National Science Foundation, they're going to say, submit that baby to the NIH because they have a way bigger budget than we do. I was told that a lot when I worked with investigators at the PUI. Yeah, that should go to the NIH. And a funny story, so this was like 15 years ago. I was in Long Beach at a hotel on an elevator, and in steps Gene Feldman, who's the chief policy officer at the National Science Foundation. And I looked at her, I was like, you're that lady from the NIH, aren't you? And she starts laughing. She's like, no, way smaller budget. I'm with the NSF. She said, but I'll let my NIH colleagues I'll tell them that you identified me with them. So I always remembered after that Gene Feldman's with the NSF and they have a way smaller budget. So, okay, and then these were the questions that we went over last time. So I'm not going to go back through them again. But any questions before we move on to budget stuff? Budget stuff. Okay, let me switch out screens then and hope this doesn't wreak havoc all over the place. Okay, are you all still seeing the screen? Yes, so and it should say fall term study group. Okay, good. Okay, so we are still here under number 2 under the life cycle. So grant preparation. As far as the full proposal and everything goes, we've kind of covered what you might see on the exam. So today we're going to spend the rest of the time specifically on budgeting. There's a lot here. I actually broke this into 2 sessions the last time we did it, and we're going to cram it into one and see what we can get through today. We have an hour, so I'm going to talk fast. Okay, budgeting. Budgeting 101. When we're budgeting, we're allowing or providing for a particular amount of money. So the sponsor is going to allow us to expend a particular amount of money on our proposed project. That's key, right? It's on the items that we have proposed. So that money must be spent within a set amount of time, that project duration, and it's subject to certain constraints, right? One thing I think sometimes we forget is that a budget is our best guess at the time based on the cost principles. And we're going to go through the cost principles. That a lot happens and can change from the time we budget and submit our proposal to the time we're awarding and expenditures are occurring. Because a lot can change in that time, the more we write down, the more we document, the more we justify what we were thinking and doing at the proposal stage, the better. I think that is all I had on that, other than I had this little quote because I think it's important, especially folks in pre-award, to remember this, or maybe even folks in post-award. Again, we do not expect your budget to predict perfectly how you will spend your money, right? The investigator has an idea of how they're going to conduct the research, but things change, stuff happens. Whether they have to communicate those changes really depends on how significant the changes are. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we talk about prior approvals and expanded authorities. So they don't know what's going to happen 5 years down the road. They might not know what's going to happen 6 months down the road. They're proposing based on what they think they're going to do. When they actually start doing the research, things change. If they didn't, it wouldn't be research, right? If we knew the answers, we wouldn't be doing research, but we don't know the answers. We just have an approximation of what's going to happen, an approximation of what's it's going to cost. So we just have to use some common sense when we're budgeting. We have to follow the cost principles, and we have to have it make sense to the reviewers. So I think that that is a kind of a little important thing to keep in mind. Yep. Let's see here. Okay, so always when we're budgeting, to be mindful of the cost principles. We're going to spend a lot more time on cost principles later, in later weeks, but it would be, I think it would be remiss not to talk about them now, because we need to have them in mind when we're talking about budgeting. So a cost should be necessary and reasonable for the performance of work. So if it's not in the project plan, shouldn't be in the budget, right? And same thing like with the justification. I always have people ask, you know, does this have to be included in the justifications? Like, was it in your budget? If so, yes, you should justify why it was there. If it wasn't, then no. The cost should be treated consistently, either as a direct or an indirect cost when proposed for the same purpose. So we'll talk about some kind of it depends scenarios around things like materials and particularly computing devices and administrative cost. Okay. Should be consistent with policies and procedures that uniformly apply to federal and non-federal entities. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about cases where it may look like on the surface something is allowed, such as childcare cost. However, if your institution doesn't routinely provide for childcare costs, then it's not an allowable cost. Okay. And all of these cost principles deal with cost allowability. Is a cost allowed on a project? And an allowable cost is one that can be charged to an award either as a direct or an indirect cost or cost shared. So remember, even to be cost shared, it has to be allowable. Okay. And then does it conform to any of the limitations set by the sponsor? If the sponsor says no, it's not allowable, then it's not allowable. Even if our institutions, it's something we would typically allow. So you might work with a sponsor who says, we're not going to provide equipment. The equipment costs are not allowable on this award. So if equipment costs aren't allowable, you can't charge them to the award, and you may not be able to cost share them either. Same thing with salary that's over the salary cap. We'll talk a little bit more about the DHHS salary cap. That is an unallowable cost. So we can't put it on our grants, and we typically can't use it to meet a cost share requirement because it's not an allowable cost. So just to keep these principles in mind as we go through. Okay, so let's talk total project costs. The total project costs are all those costs that it takes to conduct a project, whether that's, you know, a research project or service project or some other type of sponsored activity. Total project costs are made up of direct cost, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a second, and indirect cost. Okay, whether the institution is providing these costs, whether the sponsor is providing these costs, whether it's some combination of sponsor, institution, and maybe even third party, total project costs are all of the costs that it takes to get a project done. And I would argue that institutions are always cost sharing something, whether it's required or documented or not. Okay. Okay, so a definition of direct cost, and this comes right out of uniform guidance. Direct costs are those costs that can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective. Okay, so they can be identified with a particular project or activity with a very high degree of accuracy. Okay, can you all give some examples in the chat of typical direct cost? Typical allowable direct cost? Salary. Okay. Lab supplies. salary, incentives, so maybe human subject incentives, funds for equipment. Okay, any others? Travel costs, typically. Again, as long as they're benefiting the project. Sometimes tuition remission, I like that. Travel to specific meetings. Okay, yep, those are all examples because we can look at that project and say our investigators spent X amount of time or plan to spend X amount of time and associated with their institutional base salary, here's what it's going to cost. And then the associated fringe benefits with that. Or we can say our investigator is going to travel to the UK to visit a library there and conduct research. Okay. Or our investigator is going to travel to a conference to disseminate the results of this research. So it can directly be tied to the projects or activities that are being funded. Okay. Okay, so one example I had here was personnel, a lab technician. If the lab technician is working on that project, we can allocate a certain portion of their salary. If they're working 100%, we put 100% on that award. If they're only working 50%, we'd only put 50% on that award. Okay, so here are typical direct cost categories. I think you all got something under almost all of these. Personnel, so you all mentioned salary and wages, and I mentioned the associated fringe benefits. Okay, equipment cost, travel cost, you even had incentives, which are different than participant support costs. Incentive costs are usually under other, but there's also participant support cost. So if we're inviting, say, teachers over the summer to come to an in-service workshop and we're paying their travel, that would be an example of the participant support cost. Okay. And then our subaward or contractual cost or even consulting cost are also typical direct cost categories on our budgets. Okay. Some other direct cost categories, materials and supplies you all mentioned. There could be costs for animals, publication charges, consultants, computers, tuition, somebody mentioned sometimes tuition. There might be alterations and renovations, particularly if you're bringing in equipment and have to do some renovations or if you're on a construction grant. So these are just all different types of direct cost categories. Okay. Are there any others that you all routinely deal with that aren't listed on here? The only other one I could think of were patient care costs, but we're not yet doing a lot of clinical trials at CSU, so I've not seen patient care costs. That doesn't mean that we haven't had them on grants here. Okay, so we're going to go through some of these categories, and I'm just bringing up things that you might see on the exam that you might need to know about. So personnel. When we budget for personnel, we should really be thinking about the amount of effort that each person on the grant is devoting to accomplishing the scope of work. So what are the person's roles and responsibilities, and what amount of their time are they going to spend on it? As I mentioned before, the lab tech may be 100% dedicated to the work on this award, or they could be split between multiple awards. So always thinking in terms of effort, which I think is different sometimes than how investigators think about salary. At least back when I was working directly with investigators, my investigators at least would say, oh, put me on for $3,000 in the summer. They thought in terms of dollars, and I would have to change the conversation to, well, how much time, how many months are you going to spend out of the summer working on this award versus are you going to be teaching this summer? Do you have other institutional duties? What else is going on? So always thinking in terms of effort multiplied by their institutional base salary, IBS. IBS is definitely an acronym and a term that you'll want to know for the exam. So if you have an investigator who makes $100,000 for their institutional base salary, they're putting 10% effort on the award, you're getting $10,000 direct personnel cost, right? Plus whatever your fringe benefit rate is. So IBS is annual compensation that's paid for the employee. Whether their time is spent on research, instruction, administrative service, that's that employee's time. It's everything that goes into their appointment and their appointment type. And I think that's one thing that we as research administrators can be a little bit blind to, even maybe the investigators blind to what their appointment type really looks like. But IBS is any compensation they get for any of that work they're doing on behalf of their institution. And then effort, the amount of time activities will take, and we put that in a percent and multiply that by their IBS. Okay. And then what does uniform guidance say about personnel time and charging personnel time? This reference here is actually charges for work performed on federal awards by faculty during the academic year are allowable at the IBS rate. There are other references within uniform guidance that talk about that salary basis and that the amount of compensation allowed depends upon their institutional academic year IBS rate. So I'm just looking at this because I want to make sure that my reference is right, that it's not 403 instead of 430. So I will check that reference. 403 versus 430. Okay. All right. I'll double check that reference. But just know that uniform guidance does address IBS and that we can't use awards to give our investigators a raise. So personnel costs include all personnel costs, right, for our senior key investigators, students, whether they're undergrad or graduate, postdocs, associates, and other personnel that are on the award. Okay. All of those type of individuals would be budgeted under personnel. Folks outside our organization are going to be budgeted elsewhere. So personnel in your budget should only show your people at your institution. If you're doing a subaward, that organization will give you a budget and their folks who work at their institution will be budgeted under their personnel section. But that subaward cost is going to go under another cost and not under your personnel cost. Okay. Administrative expenses. What uniform guidance says about administrative expenses is that the salaries of clerical staff should normally be treated as indirect costs, as FRA, as F&A, right? Direct charging of these costs can only happen if the following conditions are met. That they are specific to the project activities, that you can identify specific individuals with those projects, and that you have budgeted for them and have prior written approval, meaning that you put it in the budget, you put it in the budget justification, and the sponsor approved it. So those conditions have to be met in order to add administrative or clerical expenses as a direct charge. I can think of just one time that we would always put administrative at a former institution, administrative expenses on an award. We had an award with one of our centers that was every other year. There was a lot of coordination of travel. And it was really over and above what the administrative assistant for that center typically did. So we were allowed to put a portion of her time on the award. And this was an award that was jointly awarded from National Science Foundation and Smithsonian Institute. And we were allowed to put her time on there because of the heavy administrative burden of booking all of the travel. Because it was getting students from all over the country to DC and setting up their lodging and setting up all the transportation within DC, to DC, and home. I always suggested as a research administrator that they use the funds to hire a travel agency to do all of this for them. That way we didn't have that need to try to segregate out her administrative time and then this additional time on the award. But the investigator was very adamant that he wanted her to do the work. So we did make a justification for it, and every year NSF and Smithsonian was fine with it. It was probably kind of a nightmare post-award for teasing that out when it came time to negotiate our indirect cost rate, because we wanted to make sure that those charges weren't included in part of that calculation. So sometimes there are ways around it, as far as we could have just hired a travel agency. To me, that would have been cleaner and easier, but it's not what the investigator wanted to do. So, are there times, does anybody want to chime in with an example where there, oh, I should also, sorry, this one. The cost also can't be recovered, as I just mentioned, as indirect costs. So in this case, we had to make sure that we weren't recovering that additional time in our indirect cost rate calculation. So are there times that you all are charging administrative costs, or you hear your investigators wanting to charge them? Does anybody have examples that they want to share?
We definitely charge them on the TRIO programs through Department of Education.
Okay.
Those allow the administrative.
Great. So on the TRIO programs,
Mm-hmm.
was it Sylvia? Is that you that were that chimed in? Okay. For your TRIO, do you allow your project directors to be 100% grant funded?
That's such a good question. How much time do you have?
And if you don't want to answer, because we're being recorded, we can talk later.
We actually have, we have 3 TRIO grants, the SSS, ETS, and Upper Bound. Right now, 2 of them are 100% funded. We did get SSS split 75-25. Okay. So that is I'd love to debate that over and over and over.
So yeah, so and I think a lot of us are aware about the the issue with 100%, because if they're doing so if your TRIO director is writing for their next round of TRIO funding, that can be a problem, right? Because they shouldn't be
correct
costs supported by a grant. Yeah.
And that goes even further discussion that even on their vacation, they're not supposed to be using their vacation to write for the grant, because the vacation is funded by the benefits of the grant.
Of the grant, right.
If that doesn't get convoluted, I tell you.
Yeah, I was at an institution, we had a lot of TRIO programs there, and that was always an issue. What we did before, we eventually put the director on just a small percentage of institutional funds, and said it was during that time that they were writing their proposal. Until then, we actually just paid them some overtime for proposal writing, so that way we had it documented on the books. So,
right. Yeah. We've done both.
Okay.
Both of those different things. So I would love to know what is the most preferred.
We did the paying overtime as we need to remedy this quickly until we can get institutional based salary. So that wasn't our preferred method, but that was the quickest way we could get in compliance.
Right.
Yeah. So Carmen, were you going to mention something about administrative expenses?
We put it on I have a T32 and a P30.
Okay.
And
training
on the
and
T32, we incorporated in one of the as an administrative expense.
Yes.
So a percentage of the person who coordinates that.
Okay.
And P32 is the same idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just that percentage.
Yeah. So that's a center grant that you have. Yes. So the center grants typically have very heavy administrative burdens, and a lot of times you will write in. You might even write in the full-time administrator.
Well,
right,
the T2 is very heavy administrator, but there is not enough administrative cost.
Okay.
Because you're pouring most of your money on the fellows or in the
right. Those are definitely good examples. TRIO programs or center grants, which are very large, a lot of coordinating efforts that you might actually write an administrative personnel into the grant, rather than taking time of a current office associate at your institution.
Correct.
So, a little bit cleaner again to write them in full time to the grant. Just let them do grant work, and that's it. They're not doing any institutional work. Okay.
Yeah. Doesn't work that way, but yeah.
No, yeah. Yeah, it's always split time, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So, okay. Any questions on including administrative expenses as direct cost? This wasn't, oh yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question about IBS?
Yes.
Yep. So if a PI is on sabbatical, and if your institutional policy pays only 80% of IBS on sabbatical, do you charge, and part of the sabbatical is to write grants or perform part of a grant, do you charge at that 80% of IBS on the sabbatical rate, or do you charge the IBS of their regular rate?
That's a good question. I've never been in an institution that had a policy that only paid 80%.
Therein lies
Their own
the
sabbatical.
real issue then.
Wow. It seems like on the surface you should only be putting 80% then on the grant, but what have other institutions chimed in? Have you asked other institutions what their policy is on that?
No, this is a brand new.
Oh, brand new problem.
Yep.
Okay.
Brand new issue.
Okay. Is anybody else on the call? Has anybody else run across that?
Does your institution have nine-month faculty only?
This is a 9-month faculty person.
I figured that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I came from my previous institution at Iowa State. We had to do that. The 80% was charged, and only if the individual had additional funding besides that on their own, then they could get the other 20%. But no, most of the time it was just the 80%.
Sylvia, does this award though cross like is there a year that they're on sabbatical, but a couple years that they're on, like you would have different rates?
Correct.
80% in one year and then they're full? Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
It only covers 1 quarter that would be
Okay.
underneath the sabbatical contract. So it's only a 3-month piece that would be underneath that contract.
It seems like it would only be the 80%, but I'd be interested to hear how other institutions tackle that. So
We'll send it to IMURA.
yeah, yes, definitely. Definitely. Okay. Other questions on IBS that can't be answered or administrative costs? Okay. Okay. Personnel. We've already talked a little bit about personnel, but also under personnel come fringe benefits. So that additional compensation that they're getting for, it depends, because it depends on what's in your fringe benefit rate, right? It varies by employee, it varies by employee class, it varies by institution as to what's included in that fringe benefit amount. And some institutions actually charge actuals to the grant. Others have a predetermined costs that they put in there for, at least for budgeting purposes, but they may actually charge the actuals. So there might not always be a one-to-one match. I was at an institution where we used basically an average for everybody, even though their actuals were different. So we budgeted with the average, but we charged the actual. So there was always going to be some discrepancies between what we budgeted and then what was truly being charged to the grant. Not sure how other institutions, but just know that fringe benefits are those extra things that you get, right? Like a company car and a house. No, no, I'm joking. They're typically covering things. And again, depending upon your institution, CSU is a little different in this regards, but it could be things like, vacation time. It could be things like health insurance. Portion of retirement. If it's one of those things, if you've seen one fringe benefit rate, you've seen one, because they vary from institution to institution. Kind of a joke here, like if you were not in higher ed, a fringe benefit could be a company car, but I don't know of too many faculty in higher ed who get a company car. Maybe they get a parking space as a fringe benefit. I don't know. We typically see things like disability insurance, life insurance, medical insurance, all the things listed here. Don't get hung up on these lists because, again, they vary institution to institution, but they're actual costs to the institution that we need to capture in our proposal budgets. And I think sometimes our investigators confuse fringe benefits with F&A costs, and very different costs, and we'll talk about F&A in just a minute. But fringe benefit rates can vary from 50% the salary charge to the grant. It could be 30%. It really depends upon the employee type. For students, a lot of institutions I was at, the students was like 1.7%. They got nothing as far as fringe benefits go. Could vary depending upon if it's a full-time versus a part-time. And one thing that's I think can be confusing, at least to new administrators, and I know most of you aren't new, is that if the person's appointment type is a full-time appointment, but they're only working part-time on the award, you're still using their employee type. You're still using the full-time benefit rate, not the part-time rate, right? Because they're still a full-time employee, even if they're only working part of their time on the grant, because hopefully they're not working 100% on the grant. So. Questions about fringe benefit rates as part of personnel cost on a grant. Okay. Equipment. If an institution has an established capitalization level, you should be using that level for equipment. It depends, again, on your institution. The second institution I worked at, Western Kentucky, our equipment capitalization level was $500. So anything $500 or greater was considered equipment, and we actually had to do an inventory tag on that equipment. The federal rate is $5,000. Some institutions may be $1,000. So we can include, though, equipment and equipment fabrication cost on our grants if it's allowable by the sponsor. So if a piece of equipment is to be built, we can look at the expenses for the personnel who are building the equipment, along with all of the fabrication costs, such as materials, services, etc., and roll that into. At our institution, we put that money in a separate account. It's called a WIP account. I'm not sure how other institutions handle it, but typically equipment and equipment fabrication are allowable costs unless your program guidelines say otherwise. Okay. So, equipment is defined in Subpart A. Subpart A of Uniform Guidance is where you find the definitions, and equipment is defined as tangible personal property having a useful life of more than a year. And then they talk about that capitalization level established by the nonprofit, which is us, right? And I just said that different institutions have different capitalization rates, but the federal level is $5,000. Any questions on including equipment? Equipment is typically pretty straightforward. Unless it's fabrication, then maybe not so straightforward. Okay. Oops. What else do we have here? Oh, if an institution has a capitalization level of $1,000 and is budgeting for a MacBook Pro, which can be pricey, would the MacBook Pro be considered equipment? So again, do I see some nods? Yes. Yeah, by that institution, it would be considered an equipment cost, and they would have to inventory and handle it however they handle equipment. Yep. Okay. Okay. Okay, travel and participant support are two other areas that typically we can directly charge to a budget. So travel will include costs for the transportation, whether you're taking a plane, driving, parking, all of those transportation costs, maybe taking an Uber, lodging cost, meals, registrations, and then you should understand that there is the Fly American Act, where we should be using a U.S. flag carrier for transportation costs, whether it's for flying actually a person or cargo. When we can, we should be using a U.S. flag carrier. There are some bilateral agreements that we have in place such as the EU has a bilateral agreement, Australia has a bilateral agreement. They change and who all is part of it, like the EU now. The UK is not part of that agreement because of Brexit. There are some exceptions to that Fly America Act. It's something that we need to be aware of as research administrators, but typically these restraints happen through our travel office. And hopefully our travel office is aware of the Fly American Act. As far as participant support costs, the nice thing about uniform guidance is they came out with a definition for participant support. Prior to uniform guidance, everybody looked to the National Science Foundation's definition because it wasn't defined in the old circulars. The nice thing is the uniform guidance pretty much mimicked, almost word for word, the National Science Foundation's definition of participant support cost. So again, this comes out of subpart A, which is your definitions and your acronyms in uniform guidance. And it's direct costs for items such as stipends or subsistence allowances, travel allowances, or registration fees that are paid to or on behalf of participants. And notice it says, but not employees in parentheses, okay, in connection with a conference or training project. So the example I gave earlier is if you're going to have, say, an in-service workshop for teachers over the summer. I worked at an institution early on in my career that we had a ton of instructional awards, and we did a lot of in-service training for teachers, and often we would pay them a stipend to attend, we would pay their transportation, we would provide meal vouchers. All of that would be wrapped up in participant support cost. The other place you might see participant support costs is on National Science Foundation research experience for undergrads, because these undergrads are trainees, okay? They're not employees in a research lab. Even though they get partnered with a researcher to see how research is conducted, they're there for this traineeship experience. And it's actually a requirement that we budget for those students under the RU program as participant support. It's really important that you understand that things like human subjects incentives should not be under participant support. Those should be under other direct costs, because once you tie funds up under participant support, you have to get a sponsor's permission to move those funds. And I've been in a situation where we had a lot of money tied up on an NSF budget for participant support costs, and even though I argued till I was blue in the face with the investigator that they weren't participant support, he budgeted them there. They were accepted there as the award. We went back to the sponsor and said, guess what, these aren't really participant support costs. Can we move the funds? And NSF said no. They said the reason why you were funded is because we thought you were supporting all of these participants and providing these traineeship experiences. Now you're telling us you're not. No, we're not going to allow you to move those funds. And it was a heck of a lot of money that the department had to come up with. So we want to make sure we don't incidentally tie up cost in participant support that actually aren't part of a traineeship experience. So the National Science Foundation has a really, I don't remember if I shared this out with the materials. Did I share out with you the NSF newsletter on participant support cost when I sent the materials? No. I will, because it's a really nice FAQ. Write myself in that. Carmen, you had a question?
Yes, one of the things that I've also experienced with regard to the human subjects being called participant, the easiest thing for me to remember is that when they're human subjects participants, they usually, that portion is not F&A subject to indirect cost. That's the beauty of that participant cost.
Okay.
When they're human subject.
Okay. So for us, the human subject incentives would be subject to indirect cost. Yeah. So, but participant support would not, right? So we wouldn't put our human subject incentive payments under participant support. I think because investigators refer to human subjects as participants, they then want to budget them under participant support, right? But they shouldn't go there. They should actually go under other direct cost. Other questions or comments on participant support cost? Okay, moving right along. Okay, so other direct costs, materials and supplies. We'll come back to computing devices in a minute. I think I have another slide on computing devices. Could be animal costs for purchasing animals, shipping them, housing them, caring for them. Could even be for protocols if you're set up that way. Our institution currently is not. I would love it if RCRO had worked more like a recharge center, but we don't. And then there could be certain costs associated with data, such as protecting that data or storing that data. And those, if you have proper justification, you can include those, typically if it's allowed by the sponsor. Okay. So supplies are defined in uniform guidance, that's subpart A with definitions, as tangible property other than those described in equipment. So I thought that's kind of funny. They're like, if it's not equipment, it's supplies. Okay, but they do go on in uniform guidance, and this actually was a change from the old circulars again, to say that in specific cases, computing devices, charging them as direct costs is allowable if they are essential and allocable, which the old guidance said, but the new thing I put in yellow for you, but not solely dedicated, right? It used to be that, you know, we would get really hung up that this computer had to be solely dedicated. And if, you know, an investigator got this computer and looked up something on Amazon, all of a sudden, wow, they didn't use this for 100% of their research, okay? Or maybe they used it to do a little bit of their classwork on, and so it wasn't 100% dedicated. So a lot of institutions really cracked down on buying computers because of that 100% dedicated. With uniform guidance, it does say not solely dedicated. So I think a lot of institutions then relaxed a little bit on providing a computer. Again, the computer or computing device needs to be used on the project, right? It has to be required for the project. It can't just be because I wanted a nicer one than what my office was willing to provide, or my office would only provide me a desktop and I really wanted a laptop, right? There has to be that essential to the project, allocable to the project. Okay. So, Sylvia, are you all, as far as computers, do you all typically allow computing devices if they're justified?
If they are justified, yes.
Justified.
It's that essential piece that gets us hung up a little bit.
Okay.
In fact, during the slide, I'm texting Carrie, going back and forth in specific situations. What do you think?
It's essential. I was never at an institution where we were hung up too much on computing devices. And so for us, there wasn't much change with uniform guidance. So.
Right. We do on the allocable, but not solely dedicated. You could, if you can identify the percentage of use for that project, allocate that percentage of the cost.
Yes.
As well.
Yep. Yep. Do you all do that often? Do you ask them what percentage? No. Okay.
No, we avoid it if possible.
I don't know. How about some people from CSU that work directly with faculty? Do we ask them to allocate, or ask them, you know, how much, you know, what percent of time or effort they're going to be using the computer on the award?
No, I make those decisions. No.
No. Okay. 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 So I think this let us all breathe a little bit easier, right? When this came out in uniform guidance and put that not solely dedicated. Okay, then other direct costs. You can read them here, so I'm not going to read them to you. And we'll move on to the next one, because I want to say something about dependent care costs. So uniform guidance does say under the cost principle, subpart E, that temporary dependent care that's above and beyond regular dependent care resulting in travel, say to a conference, is allowable. And again, it gives some conditions, just like it gave the conditions for directly charging administrative salaries, that the costs are a direct result of the travel for the federal award, that they costs are consistent with the non-federal entity, again, that's us, documented travel policy, okay, and are only temporary during the travel period. I've yet to meet an institution that actually has a policy where they're covering dependent care costs. So typically these are not allowable because they're not allowable by the institution. They may be allowable by the sponsor, they may be allowable by the terms of the award, but they're not allowable by the institution, so therefore they're not allowable. Does anybody have a policy that allows? Okay, I'm not saying there's not an institution out there. There probably is. I just don't know of it.
I don't know of any.
Okay. So if we go back to those cost principles, the first one's talking about this travel is necessary, right, for the conducting the award. It's necessary, it's reasonable charges for doing the scope of work. Here we're talking about, is it consistent with our institutional policies? And if the answer is no, then it's not allowable, because the cost principles deal with the question of, is this charge allowable? Okay. And then temporary, you can't charge all of your dependent care costs for the entire year if you're going for, 2 weeks of a conference. Can you allocate just the 2 weeks? So we're talking about allocable there. So this I thought was a really good example of showing where those cost principles come into play, but because it's not consistent with policies, therefore it's not allowable for many institutions, at least for CSU. Okay. Dependent care costs sometimes get confused with dependent care travel. These are travel costs actually for the dependents to go along with the investigator. Typically they're unallowable unless there's a really long duration, and which is defined as 6 months or longer. And you have to have prior approval from the federal agency. So again, it needs to be in your budget and your budget justification. When I was at Miami University, one of our investigators actually got into a lot of trouble because he provided, without NSF's permission, he flew his wife and children over to stay with him and stay in housing, even though he could have, because he was over there for a long time. He had traveled for a long time abroad. But he didn't have prior permission. The other convoluting factor is he then paid his wife and children to do little videos for advertisement. And so there was a big federal conflict of interest, or financial conflict of interest as well. So we were under a lot of scrutiny for that one. So the travel is allowable if it's 6 months or longer and you have prior approval. Okay, and then more, there's lots and lots of things that can go under direct care costs. One thing I want to say about memberships, whoops, where'd they go? Wrong way. Memberships. Memberships and subscriptions for professional activities are generally allowable. Again, generally, look at your program terms and conditions. But the cost of memberships to, say, a social club or a dining club, something like that, are generally unallowable. So if it's a professional membership, allowable. Social membership, not allowable, typically. Now, let's say you have an investigator who is doing research and they have to have memberships at different country clubs to go in and do the research at the country club. They might be able to make a case for that and, again, have it in the budget, have it justified, and get it approved. In that case, it would be allowable, okay? But generally unallowable. So any questions on other direct costs, or any other direct costs that you deal with here that haven't shown up yet? Okay. And I somehow, yeah, okay, that's right. I thought I went backwards again. Okay, subawards. Subawards and subcontracts. So when you have an agreement provided by one entity to another entity, right, to carry out part of the scope of work. So you have an awardee or a pass-through agency that's passing part of an award, part of the scope of work, part of those costs to carry out part of the project to another entity. Typically, it's from a university to a university. You would have to enter into a subcontract or sub-award arrangement, depending upon, is this a grant or cooperative agreement? If so, it's a sub-award. If this is a contract, then you would issue a subcontract. But the sub-awards and subcontracts, their budgets look just like ours, right? They have their own personnel, they have their own salary, wages, fringe benefits, their own equipment capitalization threshold, their own travel costs, their own indirect costs, all of that, right? So we get a full budget from them and a full budget justification from them, and then we include that as our other cost. The next two slides actually show a difference between a subrecipient or subcontractor versus, say, a vendor or a consultant. And this slide is just another way of looking at the slide above. Okay, a lot of the same information here. So I think with these, there's always gray areas where things don't really always fit, and that's where we really just have to ask a lot of questions. A lot of our institutions will have a subcontractor determination form. That's usually to determine, are they an employee or not, right? And even then, it can be a little gray. Check with your institution to see if you have one and use that. But typically with a subrecipient, again, they're doing programmatic work. They may be key personnel on the award, and likely they're going to be publishing as well. Those are usually questions I would ask the investigator. You know, are they going to be a co-PI? Are they planning to publish? Are they doing part of the scope of work? If the answer is yes, 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 then probably it's going to be a subaward. Okay? If they're providing a service that they provide to anyone, typically they have their own equipment, they have their own laptops, they have their own space. They might be then acting as a vendor or a consultant. One area that you really have to watch out for is if you're using the same consultant over and over and over, should they really be considered an employee? Also, if you're providing in your budget for space for them, or you're providing, say, a laptop for them, your institution might consider that person an employee. So be really cautious there. Consultants and vendors should be providing their own space, their own equipment, and providing their service basically to anybody for a set fee. And again, I think these two just basically say the same thing. Okay. Any questions on subaward determinations? Uniform guidance, when it came out, talked a lot about subs and subawards and subrecipients, because basically the government's saying, okay, we're going to give you, funds so that way you can do a scope of work, but you're passing some of that work on to another entity. You're passing some of the funding on to another entity. You need to make sure that they can be good stewards of funds, just like you're being a good steward of the fund. So what we saw with uniform guidance was a lot of monitoring of subrecipients. At the proposal stage, we need to collect a scope of work so we know what type of work they're doing on the project. We need to get their budget, again, a full detailed budget and budget justification, just like we're submitting, because oftentimes we have to submit that to the sponsor. Any other information that might be required by the sponsor. And oftentimes we want some type of letter signed by an organizational representative of that institution. We get this information up front to make sure that we are accurately budgeting for the subawardee, to make sure we're getting upfront commitments, to make sure that the subawardee can actually do work with the federal government, that they're not suspended or debarred from doing work with the federal government. And also we're getting this information up front because the uniform guidance says that we as that pass-through entity have to make a case-by-case determination if we consider that subrecipient risky or not. Okay. If we consider them risky, then we might have to put some additional controls on that subrecipient. So for example, at CSU, if we determine a subawardee to be high risk because maybe they're an international organization or they're an organization that's never accepted federal funds before, we might issue a fixed price budget. So we need to budget at the proposal stage, put it in the justification, and get prior approval from the sponsor. Because to issue that fixed price award, we have to have prior approval. So that's something that we want to have time to make that determination, put that fixed price budget in place at the proposal stage if we can. So just be aware that there is a lot of information in uniform guidance on subrecipients and subrecipient monitoring, and the responsibility that we have as the pass-through agency to monitor our subrecipients, to make sure that we're doing that predetermination, to make sure that we're in consultation with them to make sure that the work is being conducted and that they're charging costs that are allowable to the award. Okay, so just a little factoid here, because you might see the FFATA on the exam. Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act of 2006 says that entities receiving federal funds are required to report how those funds are being spent, including funds that are subawarded that exceeds 25,000 K. And that should have been a period at the end, not a question mark. Question. So sorry, that should actually be a period at the end. The next slide has all the references that are pertinent to subrecipient considerations and subrecipient monitoring that are in uniform guidance. So again, we have an upfront obligation as a pass-through entity to make a correct determination of whether somebody should be a contractor or vendor versus a subawardee. Okay. We also have an obligation to make sure that we have clearly identified subawards in our proposals and that we have collected all the information that we will need for FFATA reporting from them, such as their federal award identification number, period of performance, location, all the information that's basically on the cover page for us, we collect from the subrecipient so we can identify them up front and do our due diligence to determine if they are a risky sub or not. And then I mentioned this fixed amount on subawards, that we have to have prior approval to issue a fixed price agreement on a subaward. And then, oopsie, sorry. Uniform guidance also in the appendix says that all federally funded entities must be registered in sam.gov. So in order to receive federal funds, they have to be registered in sam.gov. So that's why we're collecting things like their DUNS number, soon to be that unique identity UEI number. So and grants.gov has a lot of really great information on getting folks registered in sam.gov. If you're ever working with an entity that might not be registered in sam.gov, you can go to grants.gov and there's kind of step-by-step on getting registered. So it's very helpful. And then the next slide is just a little bit on the risk assessment, which I've already mentioned, that we have to do our due diligence to determine if a subrecipient is considered high risk or not. And different institutions are going to have different levels of risk tolerance. So as long as you have your processes in place, that's what's important. So, any questions on subawards? We still have a lot of slides to go. We'll get there though. Okay, so we talked about direct costs, and then you all have alluded a little bit to indirect costs, right? So indirect costs or facilities and administrative costs are those costs that are incurred for common or joint objectives, and they're difficult to directly associate them with any specific work. There is guidance found in the cost principles for F&A in uniform guidance. And if you've not seen the University of Idaho video, probably most of you have, this is a really excellent video. And I think that as part of your homework is to go view that video, because it's a really good video that shows what goes into the indirect cost pools. Oh my goodness, going the wrong way. Okay, so indirect costs, for most of us, we will have on and off campus rates. So your off-campus rate, typically for institutions of higher education, exclude the facilities portion, right? So because you're not using your campus facilities, because you're not on campus or not, in a building or in a place that's either owned or rented by the institution. So we exclude the F, and we're only charging the administrative rate, which historically for institutions of higher education is capped at 26%. Okay. For hospitals, it's not the same. Hospitals actually typically will not have a cap on their administrative costs, but for institutions of higher education, we do. So the way off-campus is defined will vary depending upon your rate agreement. At CSU, it's so many consecutive days. Is it like 21? Is that right, Kim? 21 consecutive days at a off-campus site?
120.
Oh, 120. Well, 20, 21, 120, 120 consecutive days, sorry, at a facility not owned or rented is it also rented by the institution in ours? I should know ours better.
Just says off campus. Ours
Just
is
says,
very vague.
okay, it says off campus. So at my former institution, it just said if a majority of the work was taking place in a facility not owned or rented by the institution, then to apply your off-campus rate. So majority, you know, the PIs would say, oh yeah, 51%. Off-campus rate applies. And we couldn't split our rate between the activities on and off campus in our rate agreement. So every rate agreement is going to look a little bit different. Are there others who want to chime in on how they define off-campus or how off-campus is defined in your rate agreement? If you know.
I'll share ours, but now you're making me think twice on it.
Well, I obviously didn't know ours. 21 days, 120. I had the 1 and the 2 in there. What's
Ours
yours?
off-campus includes if they rent off-campus, we can apply the off-campus rate. If we're paying
Okay.
rent by the grant itself
Okay.
for that off-campus place, we apply the off-campus rate.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, again, they're all over the place, right? Whatever's in the rate agreement and how off-campus is defined. So
We have both the full FNA and the 26% off campus, and how
off-campus. Okay.
it depends on the funding. And
Huh.
the funding is federal, then they get the full FNA regardless. And that's a big fight all over and over all the time.
Wow.
So
Okay.
it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's a new one. It's a new one. Just when you think you've seen them all, right? We're not seeing them all. Okay, so this just shows some of what goes into the calculation for the FNA rate. So the facilities and administrative costs, you know, in the numerator with the organized research base in the denominator. So one thing that you'll notice here in the denominator is that committed cost share. So the more that we commit cost share, even in the form of providing seed programs, seed funding internally, you are going to actually effectively drive down your FNA negotiated rate, which faculty maybe don't care. Faculty would love it if we reduce that rate, right? But one reason why institutions don't like to overcommit on cost share is because you're reducing that rate. Whereas if you're in a base year and you're building a lot of facilities, you're actually going to effectively increase that rate. So that's why if you're building new research facilities, try to do it in your base year, right? Whenever they're going to do this calculation, because it's going to help increase that rate. So, but the administrative costs, again, it doesn't matter how costly these get, and the people are the costly things, right? You can still only collect 26% if you're an institution of higher education, which makes up your off-campus rate. Okay, and I have a blank slide here. Okay, question then. A PI has a project with a total cost, oh sorry, we're at time. We'll end on this question. PI has a project with a total cost cap, remember all the costs, of $200,000. Total cost, okay. Your FNA rate is 52%. How much is available for direct cost if the full FNA is going to be applied? Okay, and I have some choices here. A is 131,579, which Becky whipped out right there, right? So yeah, so the answer is that. So right, you take that 200,000 and divide by 1.52. If you're not somebody that typically comes up and backs into that calculation, that's how they came up with the calculation. You take that amount of total cost, divide by 1 point, whatever the FNA rate is, and you will come up with how much you have available for direct cost. That is a calculation that you might see on the exam. So you are allowed to take in a very simple calculator. You're not allowed to use your phone or graphic calculator, but they will ask you to back into direct costs. They will ask you to come up with indirect cost rate given a modified total direct cost rate, which we'll talk about next time, so given some certain exclusions. So unhappy with this response, the PI points out that $2,000 is going to participants, $50,000 is going to subawardees, and $20,000 will support a postdoc who's working in Panama. Therefore, the PI says that you should use your off-campus rate. What is your response to that? Sylvia's laughing.
Yes.
If you take the PI response to OSP, Michael says, they will laugh at you. I like Becky. PI needs to get over it. We've actually had some PIs argue, well, you know, my postdoc and stuff is going to be off campus and working here. Well, everybody else and most of the projects based here, we have to use the on-campus rate. Yeah, so Erica asked, how long will the postdoc be working in Panama? Is the postdoc the only one on here? Probably not, right? Especially if there are a bunch of subawardees. And just because you're sending money to a subaward, you can't say that most of that's off campus. You look at what is the work being done at your institution and are you using your institution facilities or not. But that is one argument we'll get from our faculty. So, okay, with that, I will remember, I'm going to write myself a note, that we are on the slide 31. And we will pick up with that on next Monday. Before we go, does anybody have any other questions or comments? The rest of this week, sorry, I felt like a little scattered today. Probably end of the day is not the time to do this, but we'll be going through some more on indirect cost types. We'll go through cost sharing, and then we're going to go through some other considerations that might come up on the exam, like the salary cap is one of them, to finish this section out before we move into things like the proposal review. So again, we'll split our time next time finishing this up and getting new stuff. I think the only thing I really kind of wanted you to do for homework, if you've not watched that Idaho video, it's a really, really good video. Take a look at that. I'll send the link out as a reminder. And I'll also double check that reference to see if that's 403 or 430 on that one slide. So, anything else? The time flies. Yes,
Trish,
Becky. Yep.
Do you have to know these actual CFR numbers for the test?
No.
Okay.
No. I just wanted to give you numbers if you wanted to go read what it said.
Okay, perfect.
That's
Thank
a
you.
good question. Yep. What you might need to know, Becky, though, is what subpart you would find it in. Like you would find any kind of definitions in subpart A, you would find cost principles in subpart E, you know, pre-award requirements in C. You would need to know that level, but not actual citation numbers. Good question. Other questions? It's a lot. It's a lot. So, and I apologize. I feel I was very inarticulate today. So.
Loved it. You did great.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And you know what? I'm going to poke around on your sabbatical question. So again, I would go with the 80%, but I'd be interested to hear what others would do.
I did find out that at NAU, Northern Arizona, they did always pay out on the full amount.
On the full. Interesting. Okay. Cool. I'd like to see their reasoning behind it too. They may have very good reasoning. Cool.
She
Okay.
said that it's just listed in policy, but it's really up to the institutional policy.
Okay. And so you'd have to look to see if you have anything on the books in your
Which
policy.
we don't.
So, okay.
Thank you, Trish.
Take care, everybody. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Trish.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Sure. Thanks.